What if the people who should love you most always choose someone else over you? The message came just hours before everything was supposed to begin, and yet somehow it felt like it had been years in the making. We won't make it to your housewarming. Your sister needs some groceries. That was it. No apology, no hesitation, no attempt to soften the blow. Just a simple sentence that carried the weight of a lifetime of quiet disappointments. I stared at the screen, reading it over and over again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that hurt less. But they didn't. They never did. For a moment, my fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to finally say everything I had buried for so long. I wanted to tell them how many times I had waited, how many times I had hoped, that this time would be different. I wanted to remind them of every moment they had missed, every achievement they had overlooked, every time I had stood alone, pretending it didn't matter. The words were there, sharp and heavy, pressing against the silence I had lived in for so many years. But then, just like always, I swallowed them. Instead, I typed 2 words. All good. It was easier that way. It had always been easier to pretend I didn't care than to admit how much it hurt. I placed my phone face down on the countertop of my brand new kitchen. The same kitchen I had worked so hard to build, and let the quiet settle around me. The house was beautiful, everything I had dreamed, of everything I had earned on my own. And yet in that moment it felt strangely empty. Because no matter how much I achieved, no matter how far I had come, there was still a part of me that wanted them to show up. Just once. Just this time. But deep down, I already knew the truth. They weren't choosing groceries, they were choosing her. And they always had been. My name is Grace, and I am 31 years old. But sometimes it still feels like I am that invisible little girl, standing in the corner of a room no one notices. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, where the mountains stretch endlessly into the sky, and every sunrise feels like a promise of something greater. People who meet me now see confidence, success, and stability. They see the woman who built a thriving career in real estate development, the one who turned empty land into multi-million-dollar homes, the one who never seemed to need anyone. But what they don't see is how that strength was built. It wasn't given to me. It was forced into existence piece by piece through years of being overlooked, dismissed, and quietly forgotten. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, where stories traveled fast, but somehow mine never seemed important enough to be told. I was the firstborn daughter, which should have meant something. It should have meant responsibility, maybe even pride. But in my family, it meant I was just the beginning of something better that hadn't arrived yet. That something was my younger sister, Brooke. From the moment she was born, everything shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious at first, but over time, it became impossible to ignore. The attention, the praise, the affection, it all flowed naturally toward her, like she was the center of gravity in our world. And me, I learned how to exist quietly around that. I learned how to not ask for too much, how to celebrate myself in silence, how to expect nothing so I wouldn't be disappointed. That's the part people don't understand when they look at me now. They think independence is a personality trait, something you choose. But for me, it was survival. It was the only way to grow in a place where no one was watering you. So I adapted. I built myself without their help, without their validation, without their love. And now, standing in a life I created entirely on my own, I sometimes wonder, was it worth it? Not the success, not the money, not the house, but the cost, the part of me that had to disappear so the rest of me could survive. Because no matter how far I go, there's still a quiet question that follows me everywhere. Why was I never enough? I don't remember the exact day. Everything changed, but I remember how it felt. Before Brooke was born, I existed. I wasn't extraordinary. I wasn't the center of attention, but I was there. I had a place even if it was small and undefined. But the moment she arrived, something shifted in a way no one ever acknowledged out loud. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was quiet, almost invisible, like a slow fade that no one notices until the picture is gone. I was 3 years old when she was born, too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to feel it. The house became louder, brighter, warmer, but none of that warmth was for me. It followed her. It surrounded her. It stayed with her. I remember standing in the doorway of the living room, watching my mother hold Brooke in her arms, her face glowing with a kind of love I had never seen directed at me. People came to visit, bringing gifts and smiles and endless praise. "She's so beautiful," they would say. "She's perfect." And I stood there unnoticed, like a piece of furniture that had always been there, and therefore didn't need to be acknowledged. At first, I tried to compete in the only ways I knew how. I brought my drawings to my parents, hoping they would look up and notice. I cleaned my room without being asked, thinking maybe that would earn me a smile. I tried to be quiet when she cried, helpful, when she needed something good, in every possible way I could imagine. But it didn't change anything. The more I tried, the more invisible I became. It was as if my efforts only made me blend further into the background, like I was meant to disappear so she could shine brighter. Over time, I stopped trying, not because I didn't care, but because I learned that caring didn't matter. I learned that love in my house wasn't something you could earn. It was something that was given freely to her and selectively withheld from me. Birthdays became a perfect example of this unspoken rule. Even on my own special day, Brooke somehow found a way to become the center of attention. If I had a cake, she wanted the same one. If I received gifts, she needed something too. And my parents always gave in. They always adjusted, always shifted the focus, always made sure she felt included, even if it meant I felt erased. I remember one year, especially clearly. I had been so excited counting down the days, imagining for once what it would feel like to be celebrated without interruption. But halfway through the party, Brooke threw a tantrum because she didn't like the decorations. Within minutes, everything changed. The music stopped, the attention shifted, and suddenly my birthday became about calming her down. I sat there surrounded by people and felt completely alone. That was the moment something inside me quietly broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. From that day on, I stopped expecting anything to be mine. Not the attention, not the love, not even the moments that were supposed to belong to me. I learned to shrink myself, to take up less space, to exist without being seen. Because in my family, being seen meant taking something away from her, and that was something I was never allowed to do. People always assume that siblings share the same childhood, the same opportunities, the same love. But that was never true for us. Brooke and I didn't just grow up differently. We were shaped by entirely different realities, under the same roof. She walked into rooms and the world opened up for her. I walked into rooms and learned how to make myself smaller so I wouldn't be in the way. Brooke had a kind of beauty that people noticed instantly. Soft features, bright eyes, a natural charm that made strangers smile at her without effort. Even as a child, she knew how to draw attention, how to hold it, how to make it work in her favor. And my parents loved that about her. They encouraged it, celebrated it, protected it. Every compliment she received was amplified, repeated, turned into proof that she was special. Meanwhile, I was the opposite in every way that seemed to matter in our house. I was quiet, serious, more comfortable with books than with people. I didn't know how to charm a room, didn't know how to demand attention, didn't even know I was allowed to. So I found something else. I found structure, discipline, achievement. While Brooke collected friends, I collected perfect grades. While she was being admired, I was being overlooked. But I kept going, because somewhere deep inside, I believed that if I achieved enough, it would finally mean something. I thought maybe my parents would look at my report cards the way they looked at her smiles, that they would feel proud in the same way. But they never did. When Brooke succeeded at something small, it became a family celebration. When I succeeded at something big, it was met with a simple nod if it was acknowledged at all. The difference wasn't just in how we were treated, it was in what was expected of us. Brooke was allowed to fail, to quit, to try again, without consequences. If she didn't like something, she could walk away, and my parents would find a way to support her anyway. But for me, failure wasn't an option. Not because I was stronger, but because I had no safety net. If I didn't succeed, there was nothing there to catch me. So I learned to push myself harder, to hold myself to standards no one else expected, because I knew no one would step in if I fell. Over time, that difference became part of who we were. Brooke grew into someone who expected the world to adjust for her. I grew into someone who adjusted to the world. She learned that love was unconditional, always there, always available. I learned that love was conditional, something that had to be earned, something that could be taken away. And that belief followed me into adulthood, into my career, into my relationships, into every part of my life. People see success and assume confidence, but what they don't see is the fear behind it. The fear that if I stop achieving, if I stop proving myself, I will become invisible again. Because that's what I was taught. That being ordinary meant being forgotten. And I refused to be forgotten ever again. The housewarming wasn't just a party. It was a moment I had been building toward for years, maybe even my entire life, without realizing it. Every detail mattered, not because I needed it to be perfect for anyone else, but because for once, I wanted something that felt completely mine. I had sent the invitations 3 weeks in advance, making sure there was more than enough time for everyone to plan. When it came to my parents, I didn't just send an address and a time. I included detailed directions step by step, knowing how easily they could use confusion as an excuse. I offered to cover their gas, even suggested they stay overnight, so they wouldn't have to drive back late. I removed every possible barrier I could think of, every excuse they might reach for. Because deep down, I didn't just want them to come. I needed them to. Not for validation, not for approval, but for presence. For once, I wanted to look out into a room and see them there, not as an obligation, not as a duty, but because they chose to be. When I called my mother the night before to confirm, her voice had that familiar distracted tone, like she was only half listening, while something else mattered more in the background. I could hear Brooke complaining about something, her voice sharp and demanding, cutting through the conversation, as if it belonged there more than mine did. "We'll try our best," my mother said. It was a sentence I had heard my entire life, one that never actually meant yes. I knew it, but I still held on to a small piece of hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time they would choose me. But the morning of the party, that hope disappeared with a single message. Brooke needed groceries. That was all it took. Not an emergency, not something urgent, just a simple errand that somehow carried more weight than everything I had worked for. I walked through the house slowly, after reading it, trying to ground myself in something real. The polished floors, the custom finishes, the open space filled with light, it was all exactly how I had imagined it. This house represented years of sacrifice, discipline, and relentless effort. It was proof that I had built something meaningful, something lasting. And yet, standing there alone, it felt like none of it mattered in the way I wanted it to. Because the one thing I couldn't build, couldn't earn, couldn't force into existence, was their willingness to show up. I thought about calling them back, about asking them to reconsider, about explaining how important this was to me. But I stopped myself. I had already done that in different ways so many times before. I had already asked, already waited, already been disappointed. This wasn't about scheduling or distance or convenience. It never had been. It was about choice. And they had made theirs. So instead of chasing after them one more time, I made a different decision. I let the silence stay. I let the absence speak for itself. And for the first time, instead of trying to fix it, I simply accepted it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I finally understood that some things were never going to change, no matter how much I wanted them to. The house stood on 12 acres of untouched mountain land. A place so quiet and expansive, it felt like the world finally made space for me. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened to a view that changed with the light mornings painted in soft gold evenings, sinking into deep blue shadows. Every detail inside had been chosen with intention. Every material, every line, every finish, a reflection of years of discipline and vision. This wasn't just a home, it was proof. Proof that I had taken everything I was given, or more accurately, everything I wasn't given, and turned it into something extraordinary. I had paid for it entirely in cash. No shortcuts, no safety nets, no one stepping in to help when things got difficult. Just years of relentless work, calculated risks, and a refusal to accept anything less than the life I knew I deserved. But the truth that settled heavily over all of it was this: my parents had no idea. Not about the house, not about the scale of my work, not about the life I had built piece by piece without them. In their minds, I was still the quiet daughter who left home at 18 and drifted into some vague career they barely understood. Something with houses, they would say if anyone asked, their tone, dismissive, uninterested. as if my entire existence could be summarized in a sentence they didn't bother to finish. They had never visited my office, never met the people I worked with, never asked what I actually did. Not once. And over time I had stopped expecting them to, because every time I tried to share something important, something I had worked so hard to achieve, it was met with indifference, or quickly redirected back to Brooke. Her problems, her needs, her latest crisis always took priority. So I adapted. I stopped offering pieces of my life that I knew would be ignored. I stopped inviting them into moments that mattered, not because I didn't want them there, but because it hurt less than being disappointed again. The house was the clearest example of that shift. It wasn't a secret, but it also wasn't something I announced. I didn't call them to tell them I had closed the deal, didn't send photos when the construction was completed, didn't ask for their opinion on anything, because I already knew how that would go. A brief acknowledgement, maybe a distracted comment, and then the conversation would turn back to Brooke. It always did. And so, standing in that space, surrounded by everything I had built, I realized something that felt both empowering and deeply unsettling. I had succeeded without them. Completely. There was no part of my life that depended on their approval anymore. No achievement that required their validation to feel real. And yet, despite all of that, there was still a quiet part of me that wished they could see it. Not to change anything, not to fix the past, but just to witness it. To understand, even for a moment, who I had become. But they didn't ask. They never had. And maybe I was finally starting to understand that they never would. Megan arrived an hour before the party, just like she always did when something mattered. She didn't text to ask if I needed help, didn't wait for an invitation to step in. She simply showed up, arms full of flowers, and quiet understanding written across her face. That was the difference between her and everyone else in my life. She didn't need to be asked. She paid attention. She knew. We had met during our freshman year of college, two girls who didn't quite belong anywhere yet, but who refused to stay lost. There was something immediate and unspoken between us, a recognition that we were both building ourselves from the ground up. While other people drifted through those years, relying on family support and safety nets, we were learning how to stand on our own, how to make decisions that would shape everything that came after. Megan went on to become an architect, one of the best I had ever worked with, and someone whose vision matched my own in ways that felt almost rare. She had even helped design parts of this house, adding details I would never have thought of, turning something beautiful into something unforgettable. But what made her irreplaceable wasn't her talent. It was her presence. When I showed her the message from my mother, she didn't react with shock or confusion. She didn't ask questions that would force me to explain something I had already lived through too many times. She just looked at me, her expression steady, and said, "They're not coming." It wasn't a question. It was a truth she had already accepted long before I did. I nodded, trying to keep my voice neutral, as I repeated the reason. "Brooke needs groceries." Megan let out a quiet breath, not in frustration, but in recognition. She had seen this pattern unfold over and over again. She had been there for the missed birthdays, the forgotten milestones, the conversations that always turned back to someone else. Without saying anything else, she set the flowers down and pulled me into a hug. It wasn't soft or brief. It was firm, grounding, the kind of hug that holds you together when you feel like you might come apart. "This is their loss," she said quietly. "Not yours." I wanted to believe her. I really did, because everything she said made sense. When I looked around at the house, at everything I had built, it was undeniable that I had created something meaningful, something real, something that should have been celebrated. But the part of me that still wanted my parents to be there didn't disappear just because I understood the logic. That part was older than reason. It was rooted in years of hoping, waiting, and being let down. Megan had never tried to replace my family. She didn't pretend to be something she wasn't. But in every way that mattered, she had become the person who showed up when it counted. She listened without judgment, supported without conditions, and celebrated my successes as if they were her own. In a life where I had learned not to expect much from the people who were supposed to care the most, she had quietly redefined what support looked like. Not through words, but through consistency, through presence, through the simple act of being there again and again when no one else was. And standing in that moment, with her beside me, and the absence of my family still echoing in the background, I realized something I had never fully allowed myself to accept before. Family isn't always the people you're born into. Sometimes it's the people who choose you when everyone else doesn't. It wasn't just one moment that defined my childhood. It was a pattern, a quiet, repeating rhythm of hope and disappointment that shaped the way I saw myself, long before I understood what it meant. The house I grew up in wasn't loud with conflict or filled with obvious cruelty. In fact, from the outside, it looked normal, even happy. But inside, love was uneven. Not denied completely, just distributed differently. And that difference showed itself in the smallest moments, the ones people don't usually notice, but the ones that stay with you the longest. Birthdays were supposed to be special. At least that's what I believed when I was younger. A day where you were seen celebrated reminded that you mattered. But in my house, even those moments didn't belong fully to me. I remember one year in particular, a memory that has stayed with me more clearly than almost anything else. I had been waiting for that day for weeks, imagining how it would feel to be the center of attention, even if only for a few hours. I didn't want anything extravagant, just a cake I liked, a few friends, and maybe for once my parents looking at me with the same pride they showed Brooke so easily. When the day finally came, everything started exactly how I had hoped. The decorations were up, the cake was on the table, people were arriving. For a brief moment, it felt like maybe things could be different. Maybe this time it would be about me, but it didn't last. It never did. Brooke didn't like the decorations. That was all it took. Her voice rose sharp and insistent, cutting through the room, demanding attention. At first, my parents tried to calm her down quietly, but when that didn't work, everything shifted. The music faded, the conversation stopped, and suddenly every eye turned toward her. Within minutes, the focus of the entire room had changed. My birthday became secondary, being something to pause while they dealt with her emotions. I sat there watching it happen, feeling something sink slowly inside my chest. No one told me it wasn't fair. No one noticed that I had gone quiet, because in that moment my feelings weren't the priority. Hers were. They always were. That wasn't the only time. It happened in different ways over and over again. When I achieved something in school, it was acknowledged briefly. Then the conversation moved on. When Brooke had a small problem, it became the center of attention for days. When I needed support, I learned to handle it myself. When she needed anything at all, the world rearranged to make it happen. Over time, I stopped expecting balance. I stopped believing that things would ever feel equal. Instead, I adapted. I learned to celebrate quietly, to succeed without needing recognition, to process disappointment without showing it. Because showing it didn't change anything. It just made me feel more exposed, more vulnerable, more aware of what I didn't have. The hardest part wasn't the moments themselves. It was what they taught me. That my needs came second. That my voice was less important. That love wasn't something I could rely on, only something I could hope for. And hope, I learned, could be dangerous when it wasn't returned. So I began to let it go piece by piece. Not all at once, not in a single decision, but gradually. As each memory stacked on top of the last, by the time I was old enough to understand what had happened, the pattern was already part of me. It had shaped how I moved through the world, how I approached relationships, how I defined my own worth, and even now, looking back, I can see it clearly. Not just as a series of painful moments, but as the foundation of who I became. Strong, independent, capable. But also careful, guarded. Always aware of how easily I could become invisible again. Leaving home wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no final argument, no moment where everything exploded and forced me out. It was quieter than that. More calculated. More final in a way that didn't need words. I chose a university 6 hours away, not because it was the best option on paper, but because it gave me something I had never truly had before: distance. Distance from the expectations that were never spoken but always present. Distance from the constant comparison that made me feel smaller no matter what I achieved. Distance from a place where I had learned that being seen was conditional. When I arrived on campus, I wasn't just starting college. I was starting over. For the first time in my life, no one knew who I was in relation to Brooke. No one had already decided what role I played. I wasn't the overlooked daughter or the quiet one in the background. I was just Grace, And that felt unfamiliar, but also freeing. But freedom came with a cost. I worked 3 part-time jobs at the same time, balancing classes, responsibilities, and exhaustion in a way that left little room for anything else. While other students were building social lives and enjoying the experience, I was calculating every expense, making sure I could afford the next semester, the next book, the next meal. I never asked my parents for help, not because I didn't need it, but because I understood what it would come with. Strings, expectations, a reminder that I owed them something, and I refused to carry that weight into the one space where I was finally trying to build something of my own. I studied business, focusing on real estate development, drawn to the idea of creating something tangible, something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Land building structures that existed whether people acknowledged them or not. It made sense to me in a way people never had. There was clarity in it. Effort led to results. Vision turned into reality. It was predictable in a way my childhood never was. My first job after graduation was with a small real estate firm where I was the youngest person in the room and often the only woman at the table. I learned quickly that being capable wasn't enough. I had to be exceptional. I had to work harder, stay longer, prove myself over and over again in ways others didn't. And I did. Not because I enjoyed it, but because I knew what the alternative looked like. I had lived it. Within a few years, I was closing deals that people twice my age struggled to manage. I wasn't just keeping up. I was moving ahead, building something that was entirely mine, piece by piece, decision by decision. And through all of it, something inside me kept pushing forward. Not just ambition, but something deeper. A need to create a life that couldn't be taken away. A life that didn't depend on anyone choosing me. Because I had already learned what happened when they didn't. By the time I reached my 30s, I wasn't just working in the industry. I had built my own firm, specializing in transforming overlooked properties into something valuable. There was something almost symbolic about it, taking what others ignored and turning it into something people couldn't stop paying attention to. It wasn't just a career. It was a reflection of everything I had lived through. And standing where I was looking at everything I had built, I realized something that felt both powerful and unsettling at the same time. I had become the person I needed when I was younger. The one who showed up. The one who didn't look away. The one who saw value where others didn't. And maybe that was the real success. Not the money. Not the recognition. Not the achievements. But the fact that I had learned how to give myself what no one else ever did. Leaving home wasn't about chasing dreams. It was about creating a space where I could finally exist without being compared, measured, or quietly dismissed. I chose a university 6 hours away, not because it was prestigious, but because it gave me something I had never known: distance that felt like freedom. When I arrived, no one knew my past. No one knew my sister, and no one had already decided who I was supposed to be. For the first time, I wasn't living in someone else's shadow. I was just Grace. But starting over didn't mean things became easy. It meant I had to build everything from scratch. I worked 3 part-time jobs at the same time, juggling classes, responsibilities, and constant exhaustion. While others had safety nets, I had calculations. Every dollar mattered. Every decision carried weight. I learned how to survive on very little. How to keep going when I was too tired to think, how to push through days where giving up felt easier than continuing. I never asked my parents for help. Not once. Because I knew help from them was never free. It came with expectations, with control, with the reminder that I owed them something, and I refused to tie my future to that kind of dependency. So I made a promise to myself: everything I built would be mine. Completely mine. I chose to study business with a focus on real estate development, drawn to the idea of creating something tangible, something that couldn't be ignored. Land didn't compare you to anyone. Buildings didn't care who your family was. Results spoke for themselves. That clarity gave me something I had never had before: control. After graduation, I entered a small real estate firm, where I was the youngest person in the room, and often the only woman at the table. It didn't take long to realize that being good wasn't enough. I had to be exceptional. I had to prove myself again and again, often twice as much as everyone else, just to be taken seriously. So I worked longer, hours, took on harder projects, and refused to step back, even when it would have been easier. I didn't have the luxury of slowing down. Within a few years, I began closing deals that others struggled with. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building momentum. Each success wasn't just a professional win, it was personal. It was proof that I was capable, that I could create a life that didn't depend on anyone's approval, and that mattered more than anything. As time passed, that momentum turned into something bigger. I launched my own firm, focusing on transforming overlooked properties into high-value developments. There was something deeply personal in that work, taking something people ignored and turning it into something impossible to overlook. It mirrored my own journey in ways I couldn't ignore. I wasn't just building houses. I was rebuilding myself. Piece by piece, decision by decision, I created a life that stood on its own foundation. And when I finally stopped to look at everything I had achieved, I realized something that changed the way I saw it all. I hadn't just escaped my past. I had redefined it. I had become the stability I never had, the support I never received, the belief I never experienced. And maybe that was the real victory. Not success in the way others define it, but the ability to stand alone and know that I am enough, even without anyone else saying it. If my life was defined by disciplined sacrifice and constant forward motion, Brooke's life moved in the opposite direction. Not because she couldn't do more, but because she never had to. From the outside, it might have looked like she was struggling, trying to find her place, searching for something that fit. But from where I stood, it looked different. It looked like someone who had always been given the option to stop, to walk away, to reset without consequences. After barely finishing high school, Brooke drifted from one job to another, never staying anywhere long enough to build anything meaningful. Each new beginning was filled with excitement, each ending framed as something that wasn't her fault. The job was too stressful, the boss was unfair, the environment wasn't right. And every time my parents stepped in, they reassured her, supported her, made it clear that she didn't need to worry, because they would take care of everything. That pattern repeated itself over and over again. She never had to sit with failure long enough to learn from it. She never had to push through discomfort to grow, because the moment things became difficult, someone was there to soften the impact. My parents didn't see it as enabling. They saw it as love, as protection, as doing what good parents should do. But what they didn't realize was that in protecting her from consequences, they were also protecting her from growth. Meanwhile, my reality was the opposite. When things became difficult, there was no one stepping in to help, no one offering to make it easier. So I learned to adapt, to push harder, to figure things out on my own. Over time, those differences didn't just shape our circumstances. They shaped our identities. Brooke grew into someone who expected support, who believed that things would work out, because they always had. I grew into someone who expected nothing, who believed that if something was going to work, I would have to make it happen myself. Our parents didn't just treat us differently. They taught us different rules for how the world worked, and those rules followed us into adulthood. Brooke stayed at home well into her late 20s, comfortable in a space where she didn't have to prove anything. My parents covered her expenses, managed her problems, and continued to place her needs above everything else. It became normal, expected, unquestioned. When I looked at her life, I didn't feel jealousy. I felt something more complicated, a mix of frustration and understanding. Because I could see how she had become who she was. She hadn't chosen dependency. It had been built around her, reinforced over years, until it felt natural, just like independence had been built into me. But understanding didn't erase the imbalance. It didn't change the fact that her smallest needs could still outweigh my biggest moments. That a simple errand for her could take priority over something I had worked toward for years. And that realization stayed with me, quiet but constant. Because it wasn't about fairness anymore. It was about pattern, a pattern that had been established long ago and continued to repeat itself no matter how much my life changed. And the hardest part was knowing that no amount of success on my side would ever be enough to break it. The opportunity came quietly, almost like everything else that had ever mattered in my life. An email, a call, a conversation that at first felt like just another professional step forward. But it wasn't. It was something bigger. A major television network had selected my property to be featured in a special about luxury mountain homes, a showcase designed to highlight exceptional design, vision, and execution. Out of countless properties across the region, mine had been chosen as one of the few that represented the very best. On paper, it was everything I had worked toward. Recognition, exposure, validation on a level I had never experienced before. But when I first heard the news, my reaction wasn't excitement. It was hesitation. Not because I doubted the achievement, but because I immediately thought about my parents. I imagined their reaction, or more accurately, their lack of one. I imagined telling them, hearing a brief acknowledgement, and then watching the conversation shift back to Brooke within minutes. I had lived that moment too many times to count, and I realized something that surprised even me. I didn't want to share it with them. Not this time, not this moment, not something this important. It wasn't about keeping a secret. It was about protecting something that finally felt like it belonged entirely to me. So I made a decision. I didn't call them. I didn't send a message. I didn't mention the filming crew that had arrived days earlier, setting up equipment, capturing every angle of the house I had built. I didn't explain why strangers were walking through my space, documenting details I had spent months perfecting. I kept it all to myself. And for the first time, it didn't feel like hiding. It felt like choosing. Choosing not to offer something that would be ignored. Choosing not to open a door that would inevitably be closed. The filming process itself was surreal. Cameras moved through rooms that had once only existed in my imagination. The production team asked questions about my vision, my process, my journey. They listened. They paid attention. They treated my story like it mattered. And that alone felt unfamiliar. When they interviewed me, I spoke about the work, the design, the transformation of the property. But underneath it all, there was something deeper. Every word carried years of effort, of proving to myself that I could create something meaningful without anyone's approval. The episode was scheduled to air on the same night as my housewarming party. A coincidence that felt almost too perfect to ignore. Guests would be there, the house would be full, and for the first time, the story of what I had built would be shared openly, not in small conversations or quiet acknowledgments, but on a scale that couldn't be overlooked. And still I didn't tell my parents. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. Because I finally understood something I had spent years trying to ignore. If they wanted to know my life, they would have asked. If they wanted to be part of it, they would have shown up long before this moment. This wasn't about excluding them. It was about recognizing that they had already excluded themselves. And as the day approached, as the cameras packed up, and the house prepared to welcome guests, I felt something shift inside me. Not anticipation of their reaction, not hope that this would change anything, but a quiet sense of control. For once, I wasn't waiting for them to notice me. The world would, and they would have to decide what to do with that on their own. The party unfolded exactly the way I had planned it, but not in the way I had imagined it would feel. Guests began arriving as the late afternoon light softened into evening, their voices filling. Laughter echoed through the open rooms. Glasses clinked, conversations layered over one another in a way that made the house feel alive. From the outside, it looked perfect. Everything I had worked for was there, visible, tangible, undeniable. But underneath that surface, there was still a quiet absence I couldn't ignore. I found myself glancing toward the door more often than I wanted to admit. A small part of me still expecting them to walk in, even though I knew they wouldn't. Megan stayed close, moving easily through the room, making sure everything ran smoothly, filling the gaps I didn't have the energy to notice. She didn't say anything about my parents, didn't draw attention to what was missing. She didn't need to. The absence was there, but it didn't define the night the way I thought it would. As more guests arrived, the energy shifted. These were people who knew me not as someone's daughter or someone's sister, but as myself. Colleagues who respected my work, friends who had stood beside me through years of growth, people who had chosen to be part of my life. They weren't there out of obligation. They were there because they wanted to be. And slowly, that realization began to change something inside me. At exactly 8 in the evening, we gathered in the media room. The lights dimmed, conversations quieted, and the screen came to life. For a moment, everything else faded away. The house, my house, appeared in a way I had never seen before. The camera moved through each space, with intention capturing details that felt both familiar and new. The mountains stretched endlessly in the background, the architecture framed in a way that made every decision I had made feel significant. And then came my segment. I watched myself on that screen, speaking with a confidence I hadn't realized I carried. I talked about vision, about transformation, about building something meaningful from the ground up. But what struck me wasn't what I was saying, it was how I looked, composed, certain, present. It was the version of myself I had spent years becoming reflected back to me in a way that felt undeniable. The room erupted in applause. When it ended, voices full of excitement, of admiration, of pride. People turned to me smiling, congratulating me, celebrating what I had accomplished. And for the first time, the validation didn't feel incomplete. It didn't feel like something was missing. Because the people who were there, the ones who had shown up, they saw me. Fully. Without comparison, without distraction, without conditions. I stepped outside for a moment after the viewing, needing space to process everything. The night air was cool, the mountains dark against the sky, steady and unmoving. I stood there looking out at the life I had built and felt something shift in a way I hadn't expected. The absence of my parents was still real. It still mattered, but it no longer defined the moment. It no longer had the power to take something away from me. Because for once, I wasn't measuring the night by who didn't come. I was measuring it by what was actually there. And what was there was enough. More than enough. The morning after the party didn't begin with silence. It began with noise. Notifications filled my phone, messages stacked one after another, emails flooding in faster than I could read them. People I knew, people I barely knew, and people I had never met were all reaching out with the same energy. Congratulations, admiration, curiosity. The episode had aired, and suddenly the life I had built in quiet determination was visible on a scale I had never experienced before. It was overwhelming in the best way. A kind of validation that felt earned, not given. But beneath all of that, there was something missing. I kept checking my phone, not for the flood of messages, but for the ones that weren't there. No call from my parents, no message from my sister. Hours passed, then more, and the silence from them felt louder than everything else combined. I told myself it didn't matter. I had already accepted that they wouldn't show up the night before. This shouldn't have been any different. But acceptance doesn't erase instinct. A part of me still waited, still wondered, still hoped even when I knew better. It wasn't until later that morning that my phone finally rang with a name I hadn't seen in hours, but had thought about constantly. My mother. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering, already feeling the tension settle in my chest. "Grace," she said, her voice. Sharp, not warm, not proud but strained. "Why didn't you tell us about any of this?" There it was. Not "we're proud of you," not "we saw the show," not even congratulations. Just accusation, just discomfort. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "Tell you about what I asked, even though I already knew. The television show. That house. Everything. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to find out from someone else?" The word hung in the air. Embarrassing. Not impressive. Not surprising. Not something worth celebrating. Just something that made them uncomfortable, because they didn't know. I sat down slowly, letting the weight of that settle in. "I invited you to the housewarming," I said evenly. "You had weeks to come. You chose not to." There was a pause, just long enough for her to search for a response that would shift the responsibility away from her. "You never said it was going to be on television." "The party wasn't on television," I replied. "The house was. And you would have seen it if you had been there." Silence again. But this time it felt different. Not empty, but heavy. Like something had finally been said that couldn't be ignored. But instead of sitting with that, she moved to something familiar. "Your sister is very upset about all of this." Of course she was. Even in this moment, even after everything, the focus shifted back to Brooke. I almost laughed, but the sound stayed inside me. "Why?" I asked, though I already understood the pattern. "She feels like you've been hiding things from the family, like you didn't trust us enough to share your life." That was the moment something inside me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity I had never felt before. "I didn't hide anything," I said. "You just never asked." The words landed between us, simple and undeniable. For years I had tried to include them, to share pieces of my life, only to watch them lose interest the moment it wasn't about Brooke. This wasn't secrecy. It was the result of their absence. "That's not fair, my mother," said her voice tightening. We've always supported you. I almost asked her to name one moment. Just one. But I already knew she couldn't. Instead, I let the silence answer for me. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to convince her of anything. I wasn't trying to be understood. I was simply stating what had always been true. The conversation with my mother didn't end with resolution. It ended with distance, the kind that isn't created by space, but by truth finally being spoken out loud. For a long time, I had believed that if I chose my words carefully enough, if I stayed calm enough, if I avoided conflict, things might eventually change. That one day she would hear me, that one day she would understand. But as I sat there, after the call ended, staring at the quiet room around me, I realized something that felt both heavy and freeing at the same time. I had been speaking for years. She just hadn't been listening. And for the first time, instead of trying again, I let that realization settle. I didn't reach for my phone to fix it. I didn't replay the conversation searching for something I could have said differently. I let it be what it was, the truth. And then a few days later, Brooke called. We didn't speak often, not directly, not without our parents somewhere in the middle of it. Our relationship had always been shaped by comparison, by roles we never chose but were given anyway. So when I saw her name on my screen, I already knew what the tone would be. I just didn't know how direct it would be. You think you're better than everyone now, don't you? She said, skipping any attempt at a greeting. Her voice carried something familiar, not just anger but insecurity hidden underneath it. I took a breath, grounding myself before responding. That's not what this is, I said calmly. But she didn't want to hear that. She didn't want clarity. She wanted confirmation of the narrative she had already built in her head. Mom told me everything, she continued. About the show, about the house, about how you made her cry. Do you have any idea what you've done? There it was again. Not what I had achieved, not what I had built, but how it made someone else feel. How it disrupted something that had always been comfortable for them. I told her the truth, I said. If that hurt, it's not because I was trying to hurt her. It's because she's never had to hear it before. Brooke laughed, but there was no humor in it. You've always been like this. Acting like you're above everything. Like you're the only one who works hard, the only one who deserves anything. Her words landed, but not in the way they used to. There was a time when I would have defended myself, explained every decision, tried to make her see things from my perspective. But I understood now that this wasn't about understanding. It was about discomfort. My success didn't just challenge the way my parents saw me. It challenged the way Brooke saw herself. And instead of processing that, she turned it into something easier to hold on to. Blame. I don't think I'm better than you, I said quietly. I just made different choices. That was all it was. Not superiority, not judgment, just a different path. But even that was too much for her to accept. You don't get it, she said, her voice tightening. Some of us actually struggle. I almost responded. I almost listed everything she had been protected from, everything I had faced alone. But I stopped, because I knew it wouldn't change anything. She wasn't asking a question. She was defending a version of reality that had always worked in her favor. Maybe, I said instead, but struggling doesn't mean staying the same. There was a pause, and then the line went silent. She had hung up. I set my phone down and sat there for a long moment, letting the quiet return. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't fully accepted before. I wasn't responsible for how they felt about my truth. I wasn't responsible for maintaining a version of the family that only existed if I stayed small. For years, I had carried that responsibility without questioning it. I had adjusted, softened, stayed quiet to keep things from breaking. But things had already been broken. I just hadn't been allowed to see it. And now that I could, I wasn't going to pretend anymore. Not for them, not for anyone. For most of my life, I believed that if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, became enough, something would shift. That one day the people who had overlooked me would finally see me clearly, that they would recognize everything I had built and understand who I had become. That belief stayed with me longer than I liked to admit. It followed me through every milestone, every late night, every moment where I pushed myself beyond what felt possible. It was quiet, but constant. The idea that success would fix something that had always felt broken. But standing where I am now, looking back on everything that has happened, I understand something I didn't before. Success didn't change them. It changed me. It didn't make them see me differently. It made me see the situation clearly for what it always was. They didn't ignore me because I wasn't enough. They ignored me because they couldn't see me. And that difference matters more than anything. For years, I carried their silence like it was a reflection of my worth. I thought their absence meant I needed to try harder, be better, do more. But now I see it differently. Their absence was never about my value. It was about their limitations, their inability to step outside of a pattern they had created and maintained for decades. And once I understood that, something inside me finally settled. I stopped chasing their approval, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. Because chasing something that doesn't exist isn't hope, it's a trap. And I had spent too many years caught in it. That doesn't mean everything became easy. Letting go of something you've wanted your entire life doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers, in small moments where you choose yourself instead of waiting, where you recognize that what you built has value, even if the people you wanted to see it never do. I still feel the absence sometimes. In quiet moments, in celebrations that would have meant more if they had been there. That part doesn't disappear completely, but it no longer defines me. It no longer controls how I see myself or what I believe I deserve. Because somewhere along the way I built something stronger than their approval. I built my own. I built a life that stands on its own foundation, supported by people who chose to be there, who showed up, who saw me, without needing to be convinced. And that has more weight than anything I ever tried to prove to them. Looking back, I don't see my story as one of rejection anymore. I see it as one of transformation. I took what was missing and turned it into something that could never be taken away. I learned how to show up for myself in ways no one else ever did. And maybe that's the real ending. Not reconciliation, not everything being fixed, but understanding, acceptance, and the quiet, powerful realization that I was always enough, even when no one else said it.